we'll give you time for that. So, well, hello again. So the RC14, Politics and Ethnicity. So we are very happy to launch the online seminar series for 2024. So for this very first one, the January 2024, we have with us two famous scholars, Allison McCulloch, who is a professor of political science at Brandon University, and also the editor-in-chief of the journal Nationalism and Ethnicity. So Allison today will be presenting on constitutionalism's immobilism problem. And we have Associate Professor Matthijs Bogaards, who is in the Department of Political Science at the Central European University, and will be presenting on power sharing, a bad concept. So we wish to inform you that we have a very change in our schedule. So Matthijs will be presenting first, followed by Allison McCulloch. So thank you everyone again. So over to you, Matthijs.
Thank you. I raised my eyebrow at being introduced as a famous scholar, but I take the compliment gladly. And also thank you for the invitation. This is a great initiative. So I hope it goes well. It's a huge responsibility for Allison and me, I guess. I'm gonna try and share the screen. One moment, because I prepared some slides. Okay. Can you see the screen? Right, then let's go to slideshow from beginning. Okay. Is power sharing a bad concept? Question mark. And I should emphasize the question mark. Because it is a question. It's not a foregone conclusion. Here's the outline of the paper. There is a paper. For those of you who are interested, I presented it at the ECPR General Conference this summer in Prague, and I'm now revising it. And preparing for this presentation really helped me in thinking things through. So here you have the outline. And yeah, let's move on to the introduction. So where are we in the power sharing literature? I would say, and not just me, that the field is suffering from conceptual confusion. And I have two recent quotes with people who are in the room, actually. So, you can correct me if I quoted you wrongly, but at least in print, this is what you said. So Fontana, 23, noticed that studies differ in one fundamental respect in their definitions of key concepts, including the concept of power sharing. And this is not a good thing. And then Walsh 22 says in a review that the different interpretations as to the utility of power sharing as a conflict resolution tool are the result of differing definitions of power sharing. And this is a problem, right? Because it's one thing to have abstract discussions among academics about definitions, but it's quite another when these debates and the resulting confusion affect what we think we know about the real world. So it has real world consequences and also implications for, say, policy recommendations. So this is a problematic situation. Here is an overview of some of the problems that I discuss in more detail in the paper. So if we look at power sharing, then so people define power sharing differently. The defining features are different. And by consequence, also the corresponding cases, the empirical reference, are different. So we're not talking about the same thing, and we're not talking about the same phenomena, even though we use the same term. Also, as I will show you later, versions of the same concept are not at the same level of the letter of generality, meaning some conceptions are more abstract, others more concrete. The semantic field is not adequately mapped. What that means is that we should pay more attention to neighboring concepts. Yeah, power sharing is not a phenomenon in isolation. It doesn't exist in a vacuum. So we need to map how power sharing relates to centripetalism, consociationalism, anti and counter majoritarianism. And those are some of the tasks actually I take on in the paper and that I will address briefly in the presentation. There's a growing problem with synonyms, and the person to blame is Arend Leipart, who started to use power sharing as a synonym for consociationalism because it's easier to pronounce, which is true. Yes, consociationalism is a tongue breaker, but at least we know what it is. And with power sharing, we don't. And then finally, there's the boomerang effect, meaning that valid conclusions about one version of the concept may not be valid conclusions for another. This is something that I explored in detail in a chapter that was published last year. It's called The Boomerang Effect, Lessons Learned from Power Sharing in Kenya and Zimbabwe, so where I critically discuss what are, in my view, misinterpretations of the governments of national unity in Kenya and Zimbabwe as cases of consociationalism. Okay. I'm not going to talk you through it. I just want to show what is my framework of analysis, Sartori's rules for concept formation. Now, Sartori is my hero. I have two, Arend Leipart and Giovanni Sartori. There you have it. I have others as well, but they are not relevant today. And he has these 10 rules for concept formation. And I think that working with those 10 rules can help us to clarify the concept of power sharing. So that's the promise. Now, when I made this table, it looked bigger, the font size, but I hope you can still read it. So what I tried to do here, so I surveyed the literature, both texts and databases on power sharing. And what I did is here, I organized definitions of power sharing by the number of dimensions. So a one-dimensional definition of power sharing is it's about government, about who participates in government. Another one-dimensional definition of power sharing would be it's about decision-making. And then in the final column, you have some the names of scholars who used power sharing in this way. So two-dimensional conception of power sharing as well. It's power sharing, but also power dividing. Or it's liberal versus corporate, or it's representation and participation. And here we already see why there might be conceptual confusion, because they're different. It's not just that the definitions of power sharing differ in the number of dimensions. Also, for the same number of dimensions, scholars differ in the dimensions that they identify. A three-dimensional definition of power sharing can be found in the IDC dataset, associated with PRIO in Norway. So they distinguish between inclusion, dispersion, and constraint. And then there are the four-dimensional power sharing definitions. I mentioned two here, the very influential distinction that Hartzell and Hoddy made between political, economic, military, and territorial power sharing. And then, of course, Leipart's four features of consociationalism, a grand coalition, proportionality, segmental autonomy, and mutual veto. And everything you see in this table is power sharing. And that's a problem. So I also have a solution, I think, or at least I have a way of thinking about this concept using Sartori that might clarify. So this is, and that's the proto solution right there on your screen. And please allow me to explain what you're looking at. So Sartori says that there's a ladder of generality or a ladder of abstraction. At the top, you have the most abstract general definitions. And then, of course, they have a lot of empirical cases that correspond to it. And at the bottom, the more concrete a concept becomes, the more defining features you add, the more cases you drop, until you might end up with only one case with a very specific concept, or even no cases. So in general, the rule of thumb is the more defining features you add, the fewer empirical cases you have. And that's what I'm doing on the vertical axis, and that's what highest, middle, and lower refers to the level of abstraction or the level of generality. And maybe we start from the middle level, where you find three notions: power concentration, power dividing, and power sharing. Now, this division is not mine. It's one that you find in the literature and not just in the IDC dataset. The important thing here to notice is that power sharing and power dividing, though on the same level of generality, are different. They have different features, defining features, and they have different empirical reference. Power sharing refers to the central government, so it's about sharing power in the nation's political institutions. Power dividing is about the territorial organization of power. So you can think of this as vertical versus horizontal power sharing. And power concentration is simply limiting power. Power concentration is about you're not dividing it, you're not sharing, you're hoarding it. Yeah? Let's move now to the lower level of generality, where you find two concepts: centripetalism and consociationalism. I make a big thing out of this in the paper, where I try to show that centripetalism is not a form of power sharing. It's a form of majoritarianism that can also be combined with power dividing. So centripetalism is located under power concentration and power dividing. Consociationalism, on the other hand, is located under power sharing and power dividing, meaning consociationalism combines power sharing and power dividing. Centripetalism combines power concentration and power dividing. This may seem trivial, but it's quite common recently to see centripetalism referred to as a form of power sharing. I don't think it is. It is a form of majoritarianism, and it should be recognized for that. Okay, and I hope that I'm getting sufficiently controversial already. Then moving to the highest level of generality, I located majoritarianism above power concentration. I think that's pretty straightforward. I have more problems with finding a label that is the opposite of majoritarianism, an umbrella term that captures both power dividing and power sharing. Now, one option would be anti-majoritarianism or counter-majoritarianism. The problem is that these concepts exist, and they have a very clear meaning. So I can't simply take an existing concept and say, thank you very much, and now I'm going to use it for something different from what everybody else means, yeah, because it's convenient for my purposes. That's conceptual appropriation. You can't do that. What are the alternatives? The politics of inclusion, the politics of recognition, or consensus democracy. I'm not sure about this yet. I'm not sure whether consensus democracy is the answer, is the umbrella term we should be using. But at least it is conform current usages. Yeah, Arend Leipart himself distinguishes consensus democracy from majoritarianism in his typology of democratic political systems. Consensus democracy has two dimensions. The first, executive parties dimension, is about power sharing. The second, federal unitary dimension, is about power dividing. So it works, and also empirically, because consociational cases are all consociations are also consensus democracies, but not all consensus democracies are consociations. So also in that sense, it works. By the way, I only thought about consensus democracy yesterday when I started preparing the slides. So this is all very new. But yeah, I think it works. Anyway, moving on, because I'm also looking at the time. I have 2 more slides. The first one is about conceptual techniques that we have available that can sort out most of the troubles that we encounter in the power sharing literature. The first technique is to move up and down the ladder of generality, to be clear about where we position our concept, if it's a higher or a lower concept. And I say this helps us to distinguish between power sharing, a higher level concept, and consociationalism, or more specific, so lower level concept. And then the second technique recommended is not just to move up and down vertically, but also to look left and right, so horizontal movement, differentiation. Yeah? And this helps us, differentiation helps us to distinguish between power sharing and power dividing, and between consociationalism and centripetalism. Final slide, lessons learned. I don't want to preach, but okay, here are my suggestions. Do not confuse consociationalism and power sharing. I've said this before, but I think it bears repeating. Consociationalism is a form of power sharing and of power dividing. This means that the term consociational power sharing is inaccurate. And here I revise my previous thinking, because what I said in previous publications is like, okay, so if you insist on using the term power sharing, then call it consociational power sharing. Yeah. So then consociationalism is a subset of power sharing, a subtype. But now I know that this is not correct, because consociationalism is not just about sharing power, it's also about dividing power, yeah, in the form of segmental autonomy, which means that we need a new overarching term. Even when we say power sharing, we normally don't only mean power sharing, we mean power sharing and power dividing. Yeah? But conceptually, that is inaccurate. So we need a new concept that captures both power sharing and power dividing. And that is an alternative to the opposite of majoritarianism. I suggested that could be consensus democracy, but the label is not even the most important. It's what is important is that, you know, as scholars working in this field, we agree on the logic. And finally, as I said, centripetalism is a form of majoritarianism, not of power sharing. And I know that Horowitz thinks differently, but everybody's entitled to their own opinion. Okay, thank you for your attention. I look forward to your comments and questions, and you can always email me because we don't have much time today. I'm gonna stop share now.
Great, thank you, Matthijs, for this very interesting presentation. So if you have any questions, so you may just, we may pick up the questions to Matthijs, then we move on to Allison.
Judita, you had your hand up.
I was just clapping, but thank you, Matthijs. As I'm called, there's always one. I was wondering, on the slide where you were explaining the different concepts, you had as the highest level concept majoritarianism, and then 3 question marks. I haven't really thought about it in depth, so I would be really curious to hear what you see as the counterpart of majoritarianism, whether it is proportionality, whether it is something else that you are thinking about.
Yes, thank you, and that's exactly what I have been struggling with. So I think we need a term that captures both power sharing and power dividing, and that is the opposite of majoritarianism. And I discussed briefly anti-majoritarianism and counter-majoritarianism, but these notions are taken. They're already used in the literature in a more specific sense. Politics of inclusion, politics of recognition, or maybe consensus democracy. But I'm very open to suggestions. I also thought about power diffusion, but that's not really it, right? but we need a term that captures both power division and power sharing. But even though we don't have that term yet, I think what I would be very interested to hear from the audience today is whether the conceptual logic makes sense. Yeah, that irrespective of the exact label, yes, you agree that indeed this is correct. Power sharing, as we tend to use it, normally also means power division. And then you can't, it's strange to have a word that only captures the part and not the whole. We should have a word that captures the whole, not just one part of it. Thank you.
So thank you. So we have another questions from Professor Catherine. Yes.
Thank you very much for a thought-provoking presentation. Obviously, I've only just seen this, so my thoughts are not very formed yet. The thing I like what you say about the kind of putting majoritarianism at the top, and I completely take your point that you need to have power dividing as well as power sharing in there. I think that's really important. But the problem is you sometimes get different cleavages. So you'll often have like power sharing on one dimension and power dividing on another. And that's one of the things that, like the ethnic power relations data set kind of draws that distinction between, those groups that have, for example, territorial recognition, but don't then have recognition actually at the center. So whether majoritarianism is the best term or whether we need to disaggregate it to look at what the system is trying to include, who they're trying to include, that's probably not very helpful, but that was my first reaction to it.
No, that is helpful, and that I mean, what you say is absolutely correct, and it illustrates the need to have concepts at different levels. And I've been mostly talking at the system level. And what you suggest is that if you want to identify empirically power sharing and power division, maybe it's better to move to the group level. To talk about group-based power sharing, group-based power dividing. And that if you look at it at the system level, it's too abstract and you don't do justice to the different arrangements pertaining to different groups. So what your argument, your comment is very much in line with this notion that there are different levels of abstraction and generality. Thank you.
Great, thank you. So Adrian.
Yeah, I was going to take up the point that Joanne raised in the chat, which was integration versus accommodation. Political accommodation seems to me to encapsulate the idea of both power dividing and power sharing as ways to accommodate groups. And so accommodation is different from integration. So in that sense, I would put centripetalism in the category of wanting to achieve political accommodation. It isn't an integrationist strategy. It's a way of actually accommodating groups. I think that's what Horowitz at least believes. He doesn't believe in dissolving groups, but he believes in accommodating groups, but through electoral incentives for cooperation between the representatives of different groups.
Thanks a lot. So this is exactly what Sartori calls mapping the conceptual field. So I focused on a handful of concepts and I try to, clarify their relationships. And now you say, well, what about this concept? What about that concept? And where does this fit in?
Yeah.
That's entirely legitimate. Integration, accommodation. I mean, power sharing and power division can be forms of accommodation. I would hesitate to equate majoritarianism with integration. It doesn't have to be, but certainly centripetalism has been called integrative majoritarianism. So which I find illuminating because it's majoritarianism, but of a different kind. Yeah, it's integrative. And if my framework is any good, it should in the final version be able to accommodate to say where these other concepts fit in. But I'm not there yet. But this real, thank you for making me aware of all the work that remains to be done.
Okay,
yes.
thanks.
Okay, thank you. So I think this also answers the questions in the chat. Maybe Timothy, his question, so about associational power sharing.
Yes, that's very well spotted. And this is actually one of the things I hope to work on in the future. That is more of a political theory of consociationalism. Going back to the work of Althusius, the German political philosopher, and seeing consociationalism as groups coming together in a process of consociation. And there are clear parallels with theories of associative democracy. So yes, I agree.
So, okay, good. Thank you, Matthijs, for this wonderful presentation. So, maybe a bit short of time, so we'll try to email you other questions, and then we'll try to communicate to the audience about the questions later. So, thank you again. So, we shall now move on to Allison McCulloch for her presentation. Thank you.
Great, thanks. And Matthijs, that was fascinating, and I will email you for a copy of the paper for sure. And thank you to Sheena, Timothy, and Lawrence for organizing this seminar series. As a past chair of RC14, I think they're doing amazing work on this. And can I also put in a plug to get your abstracts in for the joint RC colloquium that they are organizing in Moldova? I think it's February 1st is the deadline for the call for papers. And it's nice to see so many familiar faces here today. I'm going to share my screen and get started. We can see everything here. We can get started. Great. Okay. So today is, I believe it's day 717 without a government in Northern Ireland. And while there was a flurry of activity again last week, trying to get power sharing up and running, and the DUP have yet to agree to a return. And the failed attempt to elect a new speaker was described by Michelle O'Neill, the would-be First Minister, as possibly the last sitting of the Assembly. So this is clearly evidence of an immobilism problem, if not the end of power sharing or consociationalism in the region. So I've been working on issues of consociational functionality for some time, puzzling out why it is that sometimes the system is prone to collapse, but at other times can facilitate compromise. And as part of this, I'm struck by some of the conceptual fuzziness, and this is where I appreciate Matthijs's work here, around ideas of functionality in consociations. And I'll clarify that I'm talking about consociational systems here rather than the larger power sharing. Especially in relation to what Donald Horowitz has called consociation's immobilism problem. The other thing I think I'm struck by is that again, that variable empirical track record that prevailing assumptions would sort of contradict, right? We sort of assume that there's just a blanket kind of immobilism. So conceptually, the literature is characterized by a variety of terms from gridlock and deadlock to stalemate, paralysis, and immobilism. And of course, John Nagel has coined the term zombie power sharing to refer to that same sort of state of affairs. And so all of these seem to suggest something about the pace of decision-making. It's slow, it's sluggish, if not sometimes at a complete standstill. I'm not sure we've effectively explored the issue areas most prone to gridlock or immobilism and the conditions under which it obtains. Moreover, I think that some case-based research would suggest that the consociational state can vacillate between moments of agility and immobilism. So Hans Baumann, for example, contrasts the immobile state in Lebanon during the garbage crisis in 2015 with a more, what he calls, agile iteration of the state during the Rafik Hariri-led post-conflict reconstruction years in the 1990s. Likewise, vetoes, which are probably the consociational feature most likely to generate gridlock or immobilism, but there are lots of places in which they're hardly used at all, from Burundi and Belgium to South Tyrol and possibly North Macedonia. So I think the empirical record is often more contingent than we might suppose. So while Horowitz anticipates that, quote, stalemate, inability to get things done, and serious immobilism are the expected outcomes in consociations, I think we need more information about the conditions under which this occurs, and again, on what issue areas. So I think there's still a challenge of defining immobilism beyond that loose conception of an inability to get things done. So that's problematic both at the level of concept formation, but also in terms of political prescription. So while I don't dispute that consociationalism is prone to immobilism, but if we're trying to find solutions to that problem, then we need a much clearer sense of the phenomenon we're seeking to explain and why it will occur when it does. So what does it mean to get things done in a consociation? So I propose to start with the legislature, and I think, again, the concept might apply in other areas, but if we start in the legislature, it's an important site of seeing how successful the system is at treating public problems, right? And about citizen perceptions of whether or not they can do so. And so I propose that we need to sort of collate three kinds of information to get a sense of what's actually happening in the legislative arena. So first is to examine those issues that receive legislative assent. So what are the kinds of laws and legislation that are being passed in consociations? Those areas that are subject to veto powers, as well as those issues that don't make it onto the legislative agenda at all, right? That the parties simply don't want to touch. And so I think, again, this can offer a more robust assessment of decision-making capacity. And so not to give away the ending, I suggest that consociations are prone to a sparse legislative agenda characterized by the resolution of safe issues and the evasion of more contentious ones. And so to show this, I'll just work through the case of Northern Ireland as an illustrative example. So once considered, quote, the brightest star in the consociational universe, of course, it's encountered a series of shocks, not least of all Brexit, the boycotting of the Assembly, and the ensuing stoppage of legislative business, which have thrown open the question of the status. Northern Ireland is also an intriguing case because there are contradictory assessments of the legislative record. So McCulloch and colleagues, in comparing the total number of laws passed in the Assembly against its devolved counterpart in Scotland, have found that the Assembly passed only 8 fewer pieces of legislation over the same time period, despite the fact that the Scottish Parliament has a wider array of competences, no veto mechanism, and functions as a single-party cabinet. So they suggest, quote, this is hardly the picture of gridlock the critics like to depict. Yet, in a study by Gray and Burrell, they lament the limited legislative record, seeing difficulties in obtaining agreement on social policies connected to the need to obtain cross-community consent in the Assembly. Likewise, Wilford saw a, quote, dearth of policy initiatives and something of a legislative famine in the Assembly. Others, including some on these calls like Adrian, have pointed to the system's proneness to deadlock, and others have suggested that gridlock is a particularly pressing problem. So if the Northern Irish government can get things done, then it might help us to sort of understand the immobilism problem more concretely. If it can't, then perhaps it calls into question consociation as political prescription, as McGarry and O'Leary have called it. Okay, so turning briefly to the framework, again, this just sort of maps the number of acts of the Northern Ireland Assembly that, again, sort of is on par, as McCulloch and colleagues suggest, with the Scottish Parliament over that period of time. But what are they actually legislating on? And here we see that acts on public service provision, so things like health, housing, pensions, issues of economic development, including business improvement districts, construction contracts, and tourism, And transport and infrastructure, roadworks, rail safety, tend to occupy the legislative agenda. Issues of education, culture, and sport are less frequently legislated, though there are a few pieces of legislation here on shared education and on bullying in schools. And issues that are specific to the conflict legacy appear quite minimally on the legislative record, including one or two Commission for Victims and Survivors. In terms of what has been blocked by vetoes, again, we see some variable sort of tendencies here with that sort of high point between 2012 and 2016. So here, those kinds of bread and butter issues are not regularly vetoed, whereas issues, and again, this isn't terribly surprising, of identity and conflict legacies are. We also see, of course, a few abuses in this period, most notably on marriage equality and on vetoing investigations into MLA behavior. We see some constraining features under the new reforms to the petition of concern as part of the New Decade New Approach agreement. But I think we have too short of a period here to really sort of confirm whether or not that effect, including the requirement of having at least two parties sign on to a petition before it is enacted is working. So again, some caution perhaps there. And then in terms of what doesn't make it on to the legislative agenda, so first here I was inspired by Sarah Binder's work on the US Congress. So she calculates gridlock scores by generating a list of agenda items for each Congress between 1947 and 2000 and determines whether or not it was resolved by enacting legislation in that congressional period. So for her, gridlock is the percentage of agenda items that failed to be enacted into law vis-a-vis the total number of items on the agenda. And so she uses New York Times editorials as the basis for coding those issues that, were in the public consciousness, were sort of where there was sort of a demand for legislation, but where it didn't get picked up in the legislature. Here I use the peace monitoring reports from the Community Relations Council to sort of as an approximate here. So those track progress on the quote shared goal of a peaceful and inclusive society. And they identify a series of what they call log jams, or issues which the parties failed to move forward. So again, perhaps unsurprisingly, many of the issues here are legacy issues, such as the Maze Longkesh redevelopment, or identity issues, right? That Irish Language Act is quite consistent here, but also issues of academic selection and so on. Again, notably, not all of these have been satisfactorily resolved over time. So a lot of them are sort of subject to a kind of decision evasion. So what can we take away from all of this? The first thing I'll say is that we should not imagine immobilism as a uniquely consociational phenomenon. Indeed, many of the issues that the parties in Northern Ireland were divided over, and which dominated debate, so abortion, welfare reform, marriage equality, have deadlocked parties elsewhere, the US being a prime example of that. And indeed, Binder in her work finds a significant pattern of gridlock in the US Congress, increasing consistently over time. However, alongside the adverse effects for those for whom their rights become source of antagonism between the parties, the stakes are going to be much higher in the face of perceived immobilism in post-conflict settings. So in the case of Northern Ireland, even outside of the periods in which the Assembly isn't working, we still see those signs of immobilism. So frequently over conflict, legacy issues, identity issues, known to be sort of difficult issues between the parties. Sometimes contentious decisions are outsourced to the UK government, again, on abortion and marriage equality, on welfare reform. But again, most of those logjam issues remain the subject of non-decision making and look set to stay that way. So again, that suggests at least a partial confirmation of the immobilism problem. More generally, immobilism in the legislature replicates itself. Having made the original decision perhaps not to decide on particular issues, power-sharing partners might become adjusted to that sparse legislative agenda and incentivized to not make decisions that they might consider unsafe. And as others, including those on this call, like Joanne, have argued, as those non-decisions mount, quality of life suffers and citizens become increasingly disenchanted with the government's inability to get things done. Moreover, if informal power sharing channels close off resolution, parties might turn to more informal means. So sometimes that's the form of ad hoc mediated all-party talks like we see in Northern Ireland. In many cases, however, the parties might opt to outsource that decision-making responsibility to another authoritative body. Right, we see this again with the UK government in Northern Ireland, the High Representative in Bosnia and Herzegovina, but also to groups like Hezbollah and other members of the Zuama in Lebanon, or to the group of Hutu generals calling the shots behind the scenes in Burundi. So while that kind of outsourcing can get things done, it also, of course, has perverse incentives, relieving the parties of that opportunity to learn or relearn consensual and cooperative behavior. It also creates potentially new sources of legitimacy. So if service delivery and those sort of bread and butter issues are often a first point of contact with the state, and the state isn't doing that, but another sort of entity is, it creates, again, sort of a lack of system legitimacy. So that kind of legitimacy can be captured by political parties directly, by NGOs or international agencies, but also by clientelistic networks or military or paramilitary actors, serving to lessen the expectation that citizens can rely on the state. So there's long-term consequences to that tendency. So where do we go from here? I'll highlight two lines of future research, and then I'll wrap up. So, of course, I've just talked here about Northern Ireland, which means my conclusions are necessarily tentative, but I think the framework could be further refined by looking at comparative data. So we know that the Lebanese parliament has limited agenda diversity, more focus on financial matters, taxation, property, real estate, than it is on public service issues. Likewise, in Bosnia and Herzegovina, issues are frequently vetoed by entity voting rules or never reach the parliament in the first place. And while vetoes have not had a similar effect in Burundi, it also doesn't necessarily mean that vital interests are effectively protected or that the legislative agenda is necessarily robust. So I think the analysis invites further comparison across a wider set of cases. And then beyond extending it to other consociations, I think we need to also compare legislative immobilism to other sources of deadlock, especially in relation to government formation processes. So for Northern Ireland, this would entail consideration of the decision to boycott the assembly by different parties and the ensuing suspension of the institutions. We also, again, note that government formation is fraught in Lebanon, protracted vacancies for the presidency, time lags from election to the confirmation of Council of Ministers. It took 2.5 years, 45 rounds of voting to agree on Michel Aoun as president in 2016. He, of course, stepped down in 2022, and they've yet to find a candidate to replace him. Bosnia, Belgium have extended periods of bargaining over government posts, including the record-breaking 653 days of coalition negotiations in Belgium to form the last government. So legislative capacity and that ability to get things done presupposes the ability to form government in the first place, and that's far from guaranteed. And that brings us back to Northern Ireland. If, and I say if and not when, power sharing is to return, that new government will be faced with the tremendous backlog of issues in need of urgent resolution, suggesting that the ability to get things done will continue to be constrained for some time. Indeed, a fulsome agenda remains a far-off goal with or without power sharing. So maybe I will end things there for now. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Allison, for this fascinating presentation. I mean, it just helped us thinking in our case, in the Mauritian case. So thank you. Thanks a lot. So any questions from the audience?
Hi, I raised my hand, but I don't know if it can be seen.
Yeah.
Can I ask my
Yeah.
question?
Yeah, sure.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Allison. Thank you, Matthijs, as well. I've enjoyed many of your writings before. I'm studying at the University of Aberdeen with Joanne. My question might be a bit too contextual, so I would understand if it might be a bit off topic. But I was wondering if there was any input or opinions about whether consociationalism or power sharing mechanism, to what extent do they become a solution or a problem if they are introduced into a society where there aren't clear separation lines, assumingly to a community which doesn't have, or arguably doesn't claim to have, clear lines of homogeneous groups. The case study I'm particularly referring to is Iraq, because Iraq, for a very long time, was assumed to be a very similar consociational model to Lebanon, whereas Lebanon has historically had very clear political divisions amongst different communities, whether it's across religious lines or communal lines or geographic lines. Whereas in Iraq, not that the cross-cutting cleavages do not exist in Lebanon, but in Iraq, the issue is much more complex. The divisions aren't as clear as it is in Lebanon. So, when can we challenge consociationalism and treat it as a problem or a problem solver? I hope I'm clear. Thank you.
Great, thanks. So the first thing I will do again is put in a plug for a new special. As the editor of Nationalism and Ethnic Politics, we have a special issue coming out that looks at the comparison of Lebanon and Iraq on these kinds of issues. Many of them seeing consociation as the problem rather than the solution. So I think there would be some good work there to look at, and I can. You feel free to email me and I can point you in the right direction on that. But I think this is also a problem that occupied Leipart as well, particularly in his book on South Africa. And how is it that you can, and where I think ideas of liberal consociation were meant to come from was this idea of, if we can't pinpoint who the groups are, there are other ways to facilitate inclusion in government, but they haven't necessarily always worked out in the ways intended. And Iraq is a really good example of that, where again, those more liberal or consociational light, I think Matthijs has had to leave, but that would be his terminology for it, where they functioned much more like corporate models. So they actually then, rather than helping to facilitate effective government, they've had that more problematic or sort of immobile effect. So I think that's where I would start, would sort of be on some of that, that how liberal consociations can act like corporate consociations, helping to actually sort of reify groups that perhaps were much more, the identities were sort of much more complex or cross-cutting, if that's helpful.
Thank you, Allison. So, any more questions? Yes, we have one from Boj. So I think we are just processing. I'm just trying to process, and I'm sure I will email you because I think this is, your presentation is very relevant to the Mauritian case, because I've been thinking of legislations which don't get assigned here. At times, this has led to the resignation of the head of state. So even destabilize the government here in Mauritius. So I think, and then also lead to authoritarian tendency in some cases. So I mean, this is very fascinating and very relevant to the case in Mauritius. So I think Lawrence has one question.
And
Thanks,
yes,
yeah.
this, oh,
Sorry, no,
Go
go
ahead.
ahead and respond to that.
I was just going to say that for sure, Sheena, let's be in conversation about what that would look like. Because I'd be keen to know more about how it actually unfolds in Mauritius as well.
Thank you, Allison.
Yeah. Lawrence.
Yeah, thanks. That was really interesting and like very topical as well, obviously. So you did a bit of comparison of like the kind of amount of legislation that goes through the Northern Ireland Assembly versus Scottish Parliament. I wondered if also that you've done, or there might be value in doing some comparison on kind of different issue areas. And obviously, like, you know, some of the sort of like conflict legacy things, there might not be analogues in a place like Scotland, but I wonder just in terms of like, you know, some of the other kind of policy areas that maybe are kind of sensitive to do with LGBT rights, various different kind of sex education, for example, but other kind of educational issues. And if there's any kind of value that you see, particularly because, as you say, yeah, thanks, Timothy puts culture wars in the chat. Those kind of issues, and like, are they also playing out in kind of societies which we wouldn't consider to be kind of deeply divided societies in a similar kind of way? So yeah, is there any value in comparing not just the sort of number of pieces of legislation, but also on the kind of different types?
Yeah, and I think that's a great idea. And I think it actually speaks to sort of, so, you know, I've come to think that we spend so much time comparing consociations to consociations, but sometimes we might also benefit more from comparing them to non-consociations to sort of see, are the kinds of issues that are tripping us up, in addition to sort of like the special considerations that bring about power sharing in the first place, but are we seeing the same kinds of patterns elsewhere as well? So I think that there are those kinds of comparing across type, and a good place to start again would be that Northern Ireland, Scottish Parliament, Welsh Parliament sort of points would be a good place to start. So excellent suggestion. Thank you.
Good. Thanks. I think we are good. So thank you, Allison, and Matthijs has to leave earlier. So thank you so much again for this fascinating presentation, and thank you everyone for attending. So before I would like to inform you, before we end this session, I would like to inform you that for our February seminar series, so we will have Eduardo Abolate, so who will be presenting on a way forward adjusting Lebanon's power sharing arrangement, and we will have Natalia Kalfat, who will present on agreeing to divide governance and clientelism in post-conflict Lebanon. So if my colleague Lawrence or Timothy would like to add anything, I mean, feel free.
No, I'll just say look out for the email with the link for that. But it will be, next month.
Good. So thank you for everyone again. Thanks. Bye.